John Ralston Saul, reviewers call you a philosopher, but I know you think of yourself as a historian. I don't know whether you're wearing your philosopher's cap today or your historian's cap, but talk to me about democracy. Is there a crisis, John, about democracy in the Western world, at least in the early part of the 21st century?
I'm just wearing my cap. Whatever it is. But
well, you're not wearing a cap, actually.
Well, yes. Yeah.
Metaphorical cap.
Metaphorical cap. I think there is a crisis. I think it's entirely self-inflicted and intentional.
Wow. Explain that.
Well, I mean, I think that from 73 on, when there was an economic failure, there was a vacuum. The vacuum was not filled, and then the vacuum was filled by a theology of economics that called itself more or less globalization, and that said people were driven by self-interest, and were driven, and that the most important thing was markets, and that we could solve all problems and create growth through more and more trade. I will interject. Already, we were very close to the point where we were producing far more goods in every area than we could possibly use. So the idea that you would solve the growth problem through increased production, as opposed to rethinking the nature of production, was crazy. But that was the kind of cover. And we went through this period in which the United States and Britain led, but it had its effects directly and indirectly virtually everywhere, where we started to undermine the basic elements of democracy.
Well, let me interrupt. I half-jokingly introduced you as a philosopher and a historian, and you fell into my trap. I asked you a question about democracy in the 21st century, and you went back to 1973.
Yes.
I don't exactly know what happened in 1973.
It was the big economic, it was called the oil crisis. It wasn't an oil crisis, it was a more broad crisis.
So it was one crisis of capitalism. It certainly was no different from many other crises. But the other thing that's interesting to me is I asked you a question about democracy, and your answer was about economics. What's the relationship between, are you suggesting that there's this intimate relationship between global capitalism and the markets and democracy?
No. So the point is this, that we started down a road, and I think we're quite close to the end of that road now, so that the agonies of democracy at the moment are largely about people starting for the first time in 40 years not to believe the arguments which were introduced in 73.
And what were those arguments?
Those arguments were that, the borders had come down, it didn't matter where you were, everything would move around, there would be enormous flexibility, the market would go to where the market needed to go. And what nobody said at the time was, wait a minute, if you do that, you're completely undermining the basic tenets of democracy, which is citizens live somewhere, they're engaged in their communities, and it's through their communities and their role as the guarantors of democracy, it's through their communities that they gradually produce this representative system which puts in place policies. Suddenly you're telling us that all of this is secondary and tertiary, and what matters is not internationalism, which is a completely different thing, but something led by economics, but which will change the whole of society. If you go back and read the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, what all our leadership of the left and of the right were saying, they were all in agreement. It was a theology. And we're living with the results of that undermining of democracy, undermining of the citizens. And you can see it because when you get a group together, even today when they want to defend democracy, they can't bring themselves to use words like citizen.
You talk about 1973. When I think of what you call the kind of free market global theology, I think of Reagan, I think of Thatcher, but in 73, neither of those figures were even leaders of their own parties, let alone prime ministers or presidents. Are you referring perhaps to the Chicago School?
That's one part of it.
To Friedman?
That's just one part of it.
To people, so these were sort
Hayek,
of,
a whole bunch of them.
These were essentially the anti-Keynesians.
Yes, but being an anti-Keynesian is fine if you, depending on what your anti is. I'm not making a pro-Keynesian argument. But what's important about the arguments that were being made was the specific elements which were which would either by mistake or on purpose undermine the way democracies function. You know, if suddenly decisions of regional and national governments are limited by the fact that you have a whole overlay of things based on self-interest, to which citizens cannot reply and cannot engage, you've demeaned and rendered less powerful democracy. And that's, in exactly out of that same period, you start seeing, look at the numbers of NGOs moving from a couple of thousand in the United States to, I don't know what it is today, probably over 1 million. And you, in Britain, all over the world, and you see young generations, several generations, starting to walk away from power through democracy to what I would call fighting for good causes, where all they have is influence, they don't have power. So they're abandoning the democratic structures of power which allow you to pass laws and change things, and they're trying to influence power, and they've handed power over, by not going into it themselves, they've handed power over precisely to the people they oppose. So it's a very bad chess game.
Are you suggesting then that this globalized form of capitalism, which was born...
Well, it's not just capitalism, it's more than capitalism. It's a way of imagining society.
Well, this is the globalized market, or the globalized world, if that's not a misnomer, that's incompatible with democracy.
No, I'm not. It's the way it was done was incompatible with democracy. What was so fascinating was it was intellectually a fantastic takeover, because the whole concept of internationalism, which has always existed and which comes in many, many forms, disappeared, apparently, and was replaced by this concept globalization or globalism. And people didn't stop and say, wait a minute, there are many ways of doing things at the international level. They're not all about removing the capacity, for example, of governments to easily raise taxes in order to fund public health care. There are all sorts of other ways of doing these things. And so we're now living with the consequences of those 40 years, if that's the right math, more or less.
Well, more than 40.
More than 40 years of moving away from, democracy is this, it's not a fancy beast. It's not highly sophisticated. It really is about the base, the legitimacy that comes from the citizenry, and then this sort of building up of structures, which include school boards and water boards and mayoralties, and in towns and states or provinces and national elections, and it's an enormously complex, incredibly slow-moving object.
Are you suggesting that over the last 40 years, this kind of complex iceberg that you've described as democracy, local governments, school boards, national government, parliamentary politics, that all of that has gone away?
No, it's been undermined. It hasn't gone away, we still have it. It's been undermined. Some countries have resisted better than others in some ways. They found tricks to...
So where's been the best resistance? Canada? Germany?
No, I think probably the EU is this curious mixed bag that in some ways it resisted best at the level of fairness, which is part of democracy, it's an essential part of democracy, but it resisted in many ways less well in the sense of passing over a great deal of the citizens' influence to civil services. So that when you look at the anger in Britain, the anger in Britain isn't that Britain did badly in the European Union. Britain did very well in the European Union. The problem was that the British elite who dealt with the European Union went to Brussels and did extremely well, and went home and said they hadn't done well. They lied. But what they were saying to the people was, this bureaucracy is taking over. So they actually expanded the idea that they had lost all power and took it beyond the truth. But they never, and you can take this all through Europe, there's never been an honest conversation between the people who are elected and the population about what the trade-offs are in Europe.
I understand that, but were there those conversations before 1973? Give me some examples of how they were.
No, I'm not saying that. I'm not saying let's go back to a wonderful world. That's not my point at all.
But you are saying that 73 was the break.
There was a
and
turning
there was
point.
democracy before that, and now there is.
No, that's not exactly what I'm saying. What I'm
What
saying
would
is
be
there
your
was.
ideal model for a
Well,
democracy?
what I'm saying is there was a turning point where the capacity of citizens to have influence was radically endangered, and young people started walking away from it. And so a good example of, let's take an example like the environmental cause. I'm not a big expert. I worked for Maurice Strong, who was one of the leaders of the movement from the early stages on, but after he was no longer the head of UNEP. Whether it's, by now, if all those kids had gone into politics, we would have dealt with the problem. What we're declaring to be victories, Paris, whatever, are minute steps. And it's all we can claim to be victory. And that's in large part because there was a loss of confidence in using power through democracy in order to make changes in an area, for example, as important as that. So it ended up being governments who, because of the economic patterns set after 73, felt they couldn't move. And on the other hand, the absence of new generations in parliaments, in government, and instead they're on the outside trying to influence as opposed to having a majority and voting through laws.
So let's fast forward, John, from 73 to today. We've had over the last 20, 25 years a technological revolution. The internet, Web 2.0, these dominant platforms that allow people, at least in theory, or they would claim, to participate. And in that context, some people would say, particularly people from Silicon Valley or technophiles, they say, well, technology has enabled the very citizenship that you say was destroyed somehow in 73 with the Occupy movement, Black Lives Matter, Me Too. More and more popular movements have been enabled online. Has the internet does the internet offer the opportunity for the reinvention of citizenship that you think was somehow lost in the early 70s?
Not lost, weakened, undermined.
Weakened,
Yeah.
undermined.
Undermined.
Are you hopeful of that technology, or is the technology itself part of the problem?
I think it's a mixed bag. I'm sorry, I just think it's a mixed bag. It depends on what you do with it. It depends on what the rules are. It depends on how experiences evolve. I think you yourself have said that young people are already moving past the sense of being victims of the technology. It's middle-aged and older people who feel they're victims of it. And that's not, that all makes sense, right? Once people really know what a piece of technology is, they no longer feel that it controls them. New waves are coming. I'm not as frightened of those new waves as a lot of people, because I do actually think that we've now suddenly reached the point where people are talking about the need to get ahead of, put a shape on. We're at our best when we look at technologies and decide that we were smart enough to invent them. We must be smart enough to make them do what we want. And so when I hear people say, you don't realize, AI is coming, all is lost. And I'm thinking, wait a minute, I invented AI. Don't tell me all is lost. I invented the thing, right? So I think that in a funny way, the kind of the disasters, the recent disasters of the internet are coming at a very good time. And the interference in various elections, not just the American election, because I think it hasn't gone so far that it won't be possible to put rules in place and to be much clearer about it. So that's one thing. But the other thing is that you can do a lot through abstract indirection, i.e. the internet. But in the end, democracy is actually, I'm sorry, it's not being old-fashioned and it's not being nostalgic. Democracy is actually about people making decisions about what they're going to do. And the those movements still require those people to come together in the streets. What's so interesting is not the role that the internet played in allowing those movements to come together. What's interesting is the extent to which people are going back into the streets, having not gone into the streets in that way for quite a while now, in such numbers.
In France, in England.
Well, Black Lives Matter. I mean, all sorts of. I mean,
But also,
the Idle No More Indigenous movement in Canada in the middle of the winter. I mean, you probably don't know it, but in the middle of the winter, these kids.
You have winter in Canada?
Yeah, these kids came as if out of nowhere, Indigenous, and they started just occupying space.
Is the way to fix democracy to essentially reject the ideology of Hayek and the other sort of global free market people who, as it happened, ironically enough, also drove the Silicon Valley revolution?
Well, that's in a sense already happening. I mean, we've already left the globalist era. It started falling apart in 1995. It was essentially over by the 21st century.
Did it die in 2008, 2009 with the Great Recession?
Well, it was already dead. It was already dead.
So how do you
so these
explain-
are these are the leftover part. So what we've been moving into since about 99 is a regional theory of the world. So the aggressivity that you're seeing today in the United States, in Russia, and China is really back to the old thing. We divide the
You
world
mean
up.
the nationalism?
Well, it's not exactly nationalism. It's power.
Chauvinism,
It's a form of power.
right.
It's
The
a
great
form of
power politics.
Yeah, it's great power politics, and we divide the world up into 3 or 4 or 5, and then we fight each other over the pieces.
But is that democracy?
No, that's not democracy, but that is what has replaced globalism. It's already that
So
has
we
already
shouldn't
happened.
necessarily be celebrating.
I'm not.
The
I'm
end of
describing it.
globalism.
I mean, I wrote about this in '99. I started writing about this is what's about to happen. We're about to move from that ideology to that ideology, and neither of these are good for democracy.
But in the age of great power politics, you're suggesting that maybe democracy can thrive again. Maybe not in China or Russia, but in Canada, the United States, Germany,
It
the
can
UK.
if we go back to the base, to the citizen, to the idea of the citizen, to citizen engagement. If the civil society can find a way to continue its engagement, but include in that engagement politics, the politics of democracy, there is entirely the possibility of making enormously positive changes and dealing with a lot of the inequality which came out of the changes in '73. I mean, I keep saying it was intentional. This is not an accident. This is very clear. It's in everything they said. They never hid what
So
they
it's
were
a
doing.
conspiracy, what, of bankers and
It's not-
politicians?
No, it's not a conspiracy. It's a philosophy. It's an ideology. It was public. No, none of these people read the people they say they're following.
So it was Hayek and Friedman and their followers, essentially.
Well, much more than that. It's the business school structures. I remember talking to a large meeting of business school leaders from around the world. And I was talking about using Adam Smith as an example of someone who was massively misrepresented by this movement, and with his book, Theory of Moral Sentiments, and parts of his economic book, made it very clear that one had to have rules, control things, and so on, and that the invisible hand was like a tiny paragraph, which was about a small town, if I remember rightly. And I remember all these guys coming up to me and saying, "That's not true. That's a complete lie." And I said, "Well, have you read Adam Smith?" I said, "Why would we read him? We have quotes from him." You know what I mean? and there were a couple of other sort of historians and things with me, and they said, "You guys are unbelievable. I mean, you don't even bother reading the people you think you're following."
So one way to fix democracy is to read Adam Smith.
Not a bad idea.
Give me some other very concrete examples for people watching this, people who want to make democracy a better place and see their role in it. They're not just going to leave it to other people. They want to get involved themselves. What should they be doing?
Well,
joining school boards?
Yeah, I mean, Richard Rorty, the great American philosopher, his last book, which is a very short book, is A Violent Attack on the liberal elite structures of the United States, saying, you people have completely forgotten that democracy is not by sitting in Harvard and getting a contract in Washington. Democracy is about running for election in school boards and holding the school board, the water boards, your towns, the well-being of your communities.
Sounds to me, John, that you're a communitarian. One of the fathers of communitarianism is Charles Taylor, the Canadian political philosopher. Is this the school that you're, I wouldn't say following, sort of a representative of, developing, articulating?
Well, he's a really smart man, and a lot of what he's done is really good. And it would be, it's silly of me to do a critique of Charles Taylor, because he's a great guy. But I do think that when I look at his work, he's very, very obsessed by European philosophy. And then he tries to apply it on the ground in places and in ways where it doesn't really apply. And I think a lot of his frustration with his own engagement politically and in wonderful things he's tried to do, that it's that over-reliance on models of ideas which are really quite narrow, and were designed in large part in the context of the Paces of Westphalia, the building of the Westphalian nation state, the concept that the way to build a community which would then eventually turn into democracy, we saw, was to have states that were monolithic, that had one race, one religion, one mythology, and so on. And as the sort of centuries have gone by, we've seen that philosophy, if we're willing to admit it, has been very problematic, that it has not provided the problem. It's that philosophy and the Westphalian nation-state model that led us into the 2 world wars, that led us into 100 million dead in 40 years, that nobody had ever managed to do.
And yet you're also a defiant critic of globalization. So if you reject the idea of the nation-state and of globalization...
No, I'm not rejecting the idea of the nation-state at all. I'm saying there are many other ways of doing it. That, you don't have to think of the nation-state in this monolithic form. And one of the things that the Europeans, and to some extent the United States, are struggling with is they're so ingrained with those concepts that they can't figure out how, everybody's for pluralism. They can't figure out how in the deep model, in their deep imaginations of how a state works, they can't figure out how to have multiple personalities inside the state. They can't figure out how to be relaxed about religion, how to be relaxed about France, what you wear. Could you imagine that grown-ups in the 21st century are passing laws over what people wear? This is this deep discomfort with complexity, which comes out of the Westphalian model, and which has always been a weakness inside democracy.